Hi, everyone. We're back Wednesday morning with another event of learning about hybrid self-publishing, I guess, and
or hybrid publishing.
Hybrid publishing.
But yeah. So,
And we have a bit of a different configuration this week. The internet is not working very well where we are today, so we're sharing a desk, a table, a computer, and a microphone. Where we're often in a different room or in our individual offices. So
it's called adapt.
It's called adapt and yeah, work with it all and making it work. So question number one would be, if you're watching and you see that the transmission is really lousy and not very good, could you just send us a little note?
Post a comment, yeah.
Post a comment so that we'll know that it's either good or bad. And also, if you're watching, you can just say hi and tell us where you're from, and we'll get to know where everybody's watching from. And today, this week, we're going to be talking about, do you know your nonfiction? It's a really important subject. Since we focus on nonfiction, it's a really important subject to know, where you're writing, who you're writing for, and what you're writing, so that everything that follows your plan will make it through to the end with great success. And, so
I guess we should introduce ourselves too.
Well, I guess so. I'm John Wagner-Stafford.
I'm Boni Wagner-Stafford.
Boni Wagner-Stafford, and we are Ingenium Books. And we bring these learning events to you hopefully every week. We took, I think, a week off last week.
2
weeks off. We decided to take a bit of a vacation. We moved a bit, and here we are back.
Yeah.
So welcome, everybody.
So jumping right into nonfiction, many publishers deal with both fiction and nonfiction. Some deal strictly with fiction. Very few that we've seen or found focus strictly on nonfiction. There may be some out there, but we do focus strictly on nonfiction. Partly that's a preference. Partly it's because my background as a journalist, I just love nonfiction, and true stories is kind of in my bones, and I think nonfiction has a really important place in the world. So that's one thing. The second thing is we should start with clarifying
what is nonfiction.
What is nonfiction? So if we take a look at the word fiction, it's connected to the Latin root word fictus, which means to form. And so fiction is something that's formed in the imagination. It's not based on fact. It may be drawn from fact, but it is not based on fact. And nonfiction is, of course,
the opposite.
The opposite, right? It's not based in the imagination. It's based on true stories, actual events. Reality, yeah, in some way, shape, or form. So that's a pretty big, in the same way that fiction covers a ton of other categories within fiction, nonfiction also has a bunch of subgenres, if we say, and we can drill down almost to an infinite number. But what we've got to talk about today are the six essential different types of nonfiction. So we're going to talk about those differences. So just before we dig into that, we're going to spend quite a bit of time today, and we're here for 30 minutes or whatever. We're going to talk about the differences, but at the end, hang around to the end, because we're going to talk about the one thing that is constant through all types. No matter what type of nonfiction, there is something that is a very important element that is the same regardless of which type of nonfiction. And I'd like to know, as you're watching this, whether you're watching live or you are watching one of the replays, I'd love to have you post, if you're an author, what type of nonfiction, if you hear it or you don't hear it, love to have a comment from you about what type of nonfiction you write. And if you read nonfiction, and I'm going to also argue that any author of nonfiction should also read nonfiction. It's very difficult to be a writer if you don't also read. but what type of nonfiction do you like to read? And it doesn't have to be the same. If you're a memoir writer, it's sometimes helpful to read memoir, but what you do in your downtime and what you gravitate to, what type of nonfiction you gravitate to to consume information is good for us to know. Okay, so
let's start with the list of 6, and at the top of the list, I have memoir.
do we talk about all? No, we're going to do just one at a time.
We'll go through the 6 before the event is over for sure, and at the top is memoir. So why don't we just talk a little bit about memoir?
Yeah. So
and memoir is one of my favorite.
I know, it's fun. Memoir, it's like a memory. It's a personal story, a historical account written based on personal knowledge or direct experience. So we've published a number of authors with their memoirs. We've got Yvonne Caputo and her memoir, Flying with Dad. We've got C.A. Gibbs, who's coming out very soon with her memoir, The Picture Wall. Cynthia Barlow with Four Fridays, published in June. Steve Cedarquist with Get Out Alive. Now, something that we'll talk about at the end too is that, like so many things in the world, it's not black and white. There are shades of gray. So some of these memoirs that we've talked about are there's some cross-pollination of types. Mm-hmm. But memoir is very closely tied to the next one on our list of 6. And sometimes people get them confused. So let me talk specifically. So memoir, it can be focused around a specific set of experiences or a specific narrative. So it's related to a historical account. It's my direct experience, but it doesn't mean it's every experience. Feeding into the next type of nonfiction, autobiography. Many people confuse the two. Autobiography is the history of one's life written by oneself. So the difference between an autobiography and a memoir, though, is the autobiography will cover the entire life, the childhood, the teen years, it's the entire journey. Not necessarily just a selective journey that you're focusing on something specific,
which a memoir might do.
Which a memoir might do. And case in point, 4 Fridays from Cynthia Barlow. If you haven't got that book, you really should. It's a fantastic read. But so Cynthia wrote 4 Fridays. It is a memoir, but it is based on essentially a 4-week period of her life where she spent time with her dear friend of more than 30 years. The final time she visited with her before her friend passed away from cancer. So it's a memoir, but it's very, specifically focused on a period of time. Mm-hmm. Yvonne Caputo, closer to an autobiography, but, she started writing of her childhood. Her focus, though, she didn't write all her details. Her focus, even though it spans from childhood to her late adulthood where she is now, her focus was the relationship with her father. So in that sense, it is a memoir rather than an autobiography because she was selective in the types of material writing about.
What are a couple of examples of memoirs that are out there that people might recognize?
Eat,
so
Pray,
we've
Love.
Talked about a couple of books that we've written.
Eat, Pray, Love from Elizabeth Gilbert, very famous one. Under an Afghan Sky is a memoir written by a former journalistic colleague of mine, Melissa Fung, about her captivity. She was covering the conflict in Afghanistan as a journalist and was abducted, and the Diary of a Young Girl. You could think of Anne Frank. That that's a memoir from Anne Frank. So those are some famous ones. And the ones that we've talked about, the ones that we've specifically published with our authors, those are soon to be that famous.
Exactly.
They're very good.
So you touched on autobiography, and the next 2 actually have the word biography. One is autobiography, the other one is biography. So we've kind of identified the differences between memoir and autobiography. Autobiography being one's lifespan.
Yeah, and just before we move to biography, just checking. Oh, and there's hi CA, Ms. Gibbs, memoir junkie. Good. Yeah. love a check-in on the quality of the video and the sound if there's a comment about that. And it seems to be okay from what we can see on our side, but happily let us know. We will be happy for you to let us know. So autobiography, while memoir and the examples that we've talked about for memoir, those are quite intimate, but autobiography is considered even more intimate because of the expansive nature. It's really, all of the details of childhood, all of the details of life right up to the current point. So, and autobiographies are more, you see them more often from people who already have some sort of notoriety, politicians, entertainers. Yeah. So often, and Malala Yousafzai's "I Am Malala," for example, Nelson Mandela's "Long Walk to Freedom." Those are a couple of examples of autobiography.
And so biography, what's the big difference between autobiography?
Video and audio are perfect. Thank you.
Biography?
So biography is a story of someone's life, but not written by the author. It's written by someone else. And so there have been biographies of Princess Diana, and so again, biographies are often written about people with some notoriety, not always though. But the question often arises when we're talking about biography is, if it's not written by the subject of the biography, does the autobiographer need to have the permission of the subject being written about? Not necessarily. So if someone has a highly visible career and lives in the public eye, then it can be argued, and is argued, that that their life is on display, and you can do a bunch of research and find out information on the public record that is out there and available for people, and so it's possible to write a biography about someone without that someone's explicit permission. Now, I think it's also safe to say that a biography can be much richer if there is that permission and access to the subject of the biography. So you will see biographies rather, and where people will say, I sat down and, lengthy interviews with the subject, and they told me this, and we wandered through their house and they showed me this.
A little more objectivity probably with a broad biography.
Yeah.
Which might offer some interesting aspects of the person's life.
Exactly. The third party nature of that. So examples here, Barack Obama, the story written by David Marinus, David Garrow's Rising Star, those kinds of things are the autobiography.
Yeah. So next on the list, just because we're going to move through these 6 and get to a few other topics before we finish. Next on the list is expository.
Expository, yes.
Expository.
So I really like the expository type, and this is one of those things where I actually call this, and there's another subgenre of nonfiction that we're going to talk about that can also fall into this category. Because I'm a former journalist, I like journalistic nonfiction, the long form kind of examination. So an expository piece of nonfiction reveals the truth in something or brings to light important issues. Naomi Klein writes expository nonfiction, whether it's about social justice issues or environmental matters or, those kinds of things. The Underground Girls of Kabul, Jenny Nordberg. So it is a what the author would consider important to be understood and exposed in a way that if the expository book hadn't been written, people wouldn't know as much about it. So expository nonfiction takes incredible depth of both experience with and exposure to the subject. So experience with, it doesn't mean that Jenny Nordberg writing The Underground Girls of Kabul doesn't mean that she was an underground girl of Kabul, but she needed to do extensive research.
Yeah.
She and I haven't read that book, so I need to declare that. But she likely spent time with those girls and in that environment. So that is the expository type.
I'm just thinking of subgenres. True crime might fall underneath expository. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Next on the list is prescriptive nonfiction.
Yeah, this is also known by the name of self-help. So prescriptive, meaning writing out, think about this prescription you get from your doctor, writing out something that you're going to do and something that you're going to get. So prescriptive, self-help, how-tos all fall in this category. So enter any bookstore, go on Amazon, anywhere you look, you are going to see, self-help, self-improvement. They're always among the best-selling books. Nonfiction, by the way, we in another one of our shows that we did, we talked about nonfiction. The sales of nonfiction are very, very healthy indeed. Business and prescriptive nonfiction are the best-selling types of nonfiction. So these are the types of books, the prescriptive nonfiction, self-help, how-to. These are the type of books that people turn to, how do I tie-dye my shirt? How do I change my mindset? How do I hire the best people? How do I write nonfiction? How do I, it's that kind of thing. Healing from trauma, diet and fitness, all of those.
Would a leadership or a coaching book fall into this as well?
Yes, absolutely.
People who are, involved in leadership and giving seminars on leadership who want to be writing a book, that's the type that they'd be writing.
Yeah, exactly. So, lots of famous books in this category. Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, for example. Not so famous, Our Own Rock Your Business.
Good book.
Whatever. Somebody, you got to start somewhere.
All right. Last but not least is narrative nonfiction, which sounds really interesting.
Well, it is. And so narrative nonfiction is doesn't necessarily, you could say that all these types of nonfiction are narrative nonfiction, but there's creative nonfiction falls under here, long form journalism. We talked about the expository, literary nonfiction, any very well written piece of nonfiction, well crafted, compelling, true story is narrative nonfiction. And, I need to give a shout out to a former colleague of mine, John Oda. We worked together at the Ministry of Tourism in Ontario, and he's recently published The Kitchen, so his quest through history for the perfect design of a kitchen. So he fits into the narrative. It's not really memoir, but maybe a little bit because it's his personal experience, researching all these kitchens. It's kind of expository. I guess he thinks that, people need to know more about kitchens and the history of kitchen. But this crime, true crime, we're working on a true crime project with one of my other former journalistic colleagues, Paul Schneiderite, a true crime story that we'll be sharing more about in the next few months. Yeah. So, narrative nonfiction gets more into playfulness with the language. This is really where you distinguish from, for example, the prescriptive nonfiction. For a self-help how-to prescriptive nonfiction book, you want the writing to be fairly simple, fairly clean, fairly straightforward. Narrative nonfiction really can get quite close to fiction. You can play a lot more with your language, with ideas, and that sort of thing. So those are, I'm just looking to check on the time. Yeah, those are the 6 main categories of nonfiction, and we've explored the differences.
You were just talking about narrative and using the word fiction. Is there ever any room for fiction in nonfiction writing or nonfiction publications?
Yes. Before we go there, though, I'd like to talk about, as we promised at the beginning, the thing that is common throughout all of those subgenres, which regardless of what it is, and that is story.
Yeah.
Story. So nonfiction does not mean there's no story. Story is the foundation of the human experience. It is how, for millennia, we have shared with one another the way the world works, the way we want the world to work. It's how we learn. It's how we enjoy. It's the link to everything. And it would be a mistake to think about embarking on a nonfiction project, even prescriptive nonfiction, without recognizing that story is still important. And so what do I mean by that? You need to have a arc. There needs to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now that sounds so basic, but really, once you ask any first-time author of nonfiction, did they have trouble crafting that narrative or story arc? And the answer is going to be yes, because it's so easy to get lost in the detail. There's so much I want to say. I don't know what I have to say first. I don't know what comes second. What does the reader need first? What does the reader need second? So it's very, very important to have a clear idea about the story that you're going to take your reader on, regardless of the type of nonfiction. And in prescriptive how-to nonfiction, for example, we often, with the authors that we work with, and this, a memoir is already a story. So it's like we're not starting from zero there. But with many of our, business or the prescriptive nonfiction authors, we do have a discussion about story because it is the anecdotal elements of it. And so this is where your question comes in is, can there be crossover between fiction and nonfiction? And sometimes when you bring the elements of story into a prescriptive nonfiction, you may wish to bring in some fictional elements. And what I mean by that is, so nonfiction is true. It is based on a truth. But let's say, for example, that you're writing a how-to leadership book and you want to, and Gwen Tetreault and Lisa with oh my goodness, the titles just, Gwen is in the thick of it, and Lisa King is Just Be You, Just Do You. I forget, something like that. I'm sorry, Lisa, I should have had my list in front of me. But there are anecdotal stories that both of these authors needed to tell in their prescriptive nonfiction, their self-help how-to leadership books, that they needed to fictionalize in order to protect the identity of the person that they're talking about. So most often, so that's bringing in a fictional element. Let's say that you have an interchange with a male person and it is demonstrative of something that you do not want your reader to do. So you're demonstrating the negative side of it, but you don't really want to call out Tom Smith for his abominable behavior. So you change the location, you change it to a female, you change the age, you change the context. So it's fictionalizing nonfiction, but it's really bringing in elements of fiction and is part of the storytelling. So that it becomes part of the story.
So when we talk about fiction, bringing fiction into nonfiction, there's a lot of dialogue in fiction. Is there any room for dialogue in nonfiction?
I believe yes. And there, lots of debate out there, and some people say no, if nonfiction doesn't have dialogue. And in fact, some people will say, well, I can't put that dialogue in my nonfiction because I don't remember exactly how it went. You don't have to remember exactly how it went, but so dialogue is very important for the reader experience. And so if you're in the middle of an anecdotal story, and it applies for any of the subgenres of nonfiction, any anecdotal story can be best demonstrated through the use of nonfiction. So I'm talking about an interchange. I'm talking about you and I, we sat down for a meeting, and so, show what happened through dialogue. And there's that magic word, show.
Not tell.
Yeah, show, not tell. So dialogue in our, the show, the live thing we did a couple of weeks ago, myself and Marie Beswick-Arthur, we talked about show versus tell. And Marie is saying that the most effective way to show rather than tell is through the use of dialogue. So we have a couple of blogs on our site about dialogue in nonfiction and ways to, why use it and ways to use it. And so I think that would be, those would be good blogs to check out. There are some things around dialogue that you want to be aware of, which is, it adds a little bit it's easier to write prescriptive nonfiction, for example, without any dialogue in it. So, and you do want to keep your writing clear, clean, and simple for prescriptive. With dialogue, and as soon as you use dialogue, you must be cognizant of different styles. And what I mean by that is you're writing your book in your own voice. As soon as you include dialogue from somebody else, you must be cognizant of it being in their voice. Mm-hmm. And if it's dialogue between two people, there must be differences in the voices of those two people. They can't all talk the same.
Yeah.
The reader will pick up on that. You might not be able to pick up on that, but the reader will pick up on that.
It won't be natural.
It won't be natural. And, we were, because we were watching an Amazon series. Which one? It was the crime one based on, whatever. I can't remember the name. Anyway.
Justified.
No, not Justified. It was the previous one before that. But I read all the books, Michael Connelly's books based on this detective whose name I can't remember. Yeah. Harry. So they had written all the dialogue. It took into the second season before I stopped being bothered by the fact that every person spoke with the same clipped affliction. So those writers of those screenplays didn't recognize or didn't treat the dialogue for each character. They didn't go as deep into making sure that the dialogue was true to the character. They were all the same.
And therefore the characters weren't as rich as they could have been. Right. So missed opportunity to make those characters as rich as they can be.
Yeah.
We're just closing in on the last few minutes here. So dialogue, really important, storytelling, really important. And again, I think one of the most interesting things is story is so important, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, story. Right. One last area that I wanted to get to is we mentioned subgenres a little bit. Why don't we talk just for a couple of seconds about subgenres and what they mean, and how do we recognize those
and why they're important to recognize. So thinking about which kind of nonfiction you write, and beyond each of those 6 broad categories, there are, you can drill down and almost go as deep as you want. And another way to think about that is to, go to Amazon, go to the books and go to nonfiction and look at how many categories. So you can think about those categories in a way, and it's not, but you can think about those categories partly as sub genres.
Bosch was the name of this series.
Bosch, right. Good series, but the dialogue drove me nuts for the first. Anyway, so why is it important to make sure that you are understanding which of the subgenres writ large that you're writing in, and also drilling down a little deeper into the sub? And the reason is, well, first of all, it helps your writing immensely because you know what you're doing. The second big thing is that's part of identifying your reader. Yeah. And identifying your reader is, we argue, important. One of the first things out of the gate that you want to do when you start to think about writing your book. Who am I writing for? Who's going to read it? And as opposed to being a restrictive, oh my God, I want to write for everybody in every genre, I want my book to be read by as many people as possible. It actually helps you facilitate the things that you're going to say. And so a reader, think about nonfiction business, for example. There are a gazillion potential readers of business nonfiction, but the business leadership reader is not necessarily the same reader as the business online course development reader. Henrik Mondrup's book, Achieving Change, for example, even though Gwyn's in the thick of it
She goes down another level by targeting middle management people.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly.
So there's another subgenre.
So subgenre. I think that's very, very heavily linked to identifying
your target audience,
your reader. Yes, exactly. So we just whipped through 30 minutes. And C.A. Gibbs, thank you for your comments. I'm glad you liked the discussion about dialogue. And yeah, I remember you and I having the conversation, but I don't remember exactly what we said. And I'm like, who cares? Like, it doesn't matter. It's more important that you show dialogue. And so you've got that down pat. So glad the video and audio seem to work. It's kind of fun to be sitting right beside you.
It is.
Perhaps next week when we're doing it from the boat. Although next week I think I'm doing another one with Marie.
Yeah.
More writing tips. But thank you so much for joining us. Please consider sharing and again leaving comments where you're from, what your type, what type of nonfiction you write, what type of nonfiction you read, and any questions you have about nonfiction. We're always happy to entertain them.
Yeah. Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks very much.